Ben, as Kilo says, I'm co-artistic director of New Common Theatre. We are a Chinese and international group of artists and NGO leaders and workers doing theatre in factories. And I'm sorry, this is really shameful for an actor not to be off script. But I'm still on script. So, Wang Chuntat and I met at theatre school in Paris. He's a performing artist. His family are from a coastal city in the south of China called Dongguan. His aunts and uncles are workers on assembly lines. Chuntat invited me to China to develop a piece of theatre in factories. Well, like so many onlookers, I was gripped by the awesome scale of Chinese production. And what I saw was the already theatrical energy of factory towns like Dongguan. I had what you might call a spatial interest in these places, and at best, only a peripheral understanding of the people that lived and worked in them. With a few leads from Wang Chuntat, I arrived in Guangzhou in March this year. By way of a doctor, a purse wholesaler, and a watch factory owner, I began spending time in factories. Because I knew nothing about the contexts I was working in, everything came as a surprise. One, people working in factories are young. 61% of China's 265 million migrant workers are aged between 16 and 30. The second thing was that this young group, it's difficult to generalize, but often feel frustrated and disempowered by their situation, as their position as factory workers. And the third is that there's a movement of workers using theatre as a source of empowerment. Well, as an actor and theatre maker, I was most interested in the last of these discoveries. But I couldn't see why or how theatre was helping. Rights-based advocacy among workers I could understand, but what can theatre do, really? Well, an answer began to arrive here when I was invited to teach theatre to the children of migrant workers in a Beijing suburb. After a few days of workshops, a teacher at the community school asked me if the children could make a play about domestic violence. We were doing the workshops just in a village square outside the school. And 2 days later, a parent came and asked me if we could make a play about discrimination against left-handed children. So in this Beijing suburb, theatre could be, the use of theatre could be summarized as a tool for solving, for dealing with issues, problems faced by a community. That's us going in on the first day of workshops. I started getting invited to run theatre workshops at workers' community centres across China. As well as providing legal advice and training sessions, the centres offer companionship, support, camaraderie, encouragement, and crucially, a space for the expression of daily pressures and problems. The social workers founding and running these centres are often former factory workers themselves. Most have come to social work by way of first-hand experience as a complainant in a labour dispute, more often than not related to an injury in the workplace. Social workers often have gnarled hands and forearms. These centres face three obstacles above all others when it comes to doing rights advocacy. One, most workers are reluctant to give public speeches and do advocacy themselves. Two, there's a lack of social recognition around rights and gender. Three, most workers are migrants from various regions in China, making it difficult to build a sense of solidarity and common purpose. I'm often told that workers are not good at expressing themselves. Well, I met a social worker from Guangzhou recently who suffered an injury in a factory making machinery for textile production in 2008. She said, "I don't think this reluctance to speak up comes from workers. It's more structural. Factories don't give workers an opportunity to express themselves, so they remain silent. I don't buy that factory managers are to blame personally for this either. It's not their personality, it's the position they occupy." This social worker's family are farmers from Hunan. She has one sister and one brother, both of them older. By way of her injury, she became involved with an NGO in the South Chinatown of Zhongshan. The NGO helped her claim compensation. In 2009, she attended a training session on gender awareness, and it changed the course of her life. "There is a social expectation on you as a woman," she said. "My sister and I weren't allowed to go to school when my brother was. Most factory managers are men. Why? Significant positions in society are made and held by men. I just thought that's how things were." Her injury made a big impact on her life. She'd planned to save up and start her own enterprise, but after the injury, she wanted to give something back to the Zhongshan NGO that had helped her, out of gratitude. It was as a volunteer that she discovered work-related injuries are ubiquitous, and that they can have a serious effect on workers' lives. She started asking what was behind each case. Why did each case arise? She began drafting advice on social insurance and sending it to municipal and provincial government. "I earn less now than I did as a common worker," she said. "It's not unusual for us to go unpaid for up to 6 months. At the community centre, we make and sell hairbands, oven gloves, inner soles for shoes, things like that, in order to get by. Production costs are very low, and sewing machines are donated." Well, at this Guangzhou centre and others like it in Tianjin, Foshan, and Shenzhen, workers have been using our theatre workshops and performances to tell their stories. Remembered childhoods in the countryside, sacrifice of parents for their children, of children for their parents, injury in the workplace, greedy factory owners, domestic violence, trickery in the form of pyramid schemes or the false promise of employment, pressure from home to marry, the difficulty of finding a partner in places with extremely high staff liquidity and where people come from all over China. Sometimes workers tell their own story in our workshops, and sometimes we ask them to share it with another workshop participant, who will in turn share it with the group on behalf of the person it happened to. The latter has been quite effective. Generally speaking, it's less awkward to tell someone else's story, and you tend to tell it with more generosity than if it had been your own. Sometimes we enact stories as a group. A workshop we did recently in Shenzhen was attended exclusively by migrant workers from Hunan, Sichuan, and Guangxi provinces. Some of them told stories about growing up in the countryside, creeping into a neighbor's orchard to steal fruit under the cover of night, being rescued from drowning in a reservoir, driving cattle across great distances. Others told stories of the journey, boarding a coach and traveling for 4 days and 4 nights to arrive at a factory. Others about a short-lived romance and the difficulty of finding love. Some about betrayal, some about injuries and unfair dismissal. We put the stories together in chronological order, beginning as children in the countryside and ending as adults in the factory. When we came to do the performance, the people in the audience, who all of them were workers from nearby factories, heard the stories as just one narrative, even though they belonged to different people from various provinces. A man from Hunan stood up afterwards and said, "I really thought those stories belonged to just one person. Hearing that they belong to different people from Guangxi and Sichuan, well, I don't know why, but I'm moved by that." Rural-urban migration in China since the late 70s constitutes the single largest human migration in history. And there are so many stories rising up from it and being reabsorbed by it, like cresting waves on a great swelling tide. In the workshops, there's often this sense of collective memory and collective imagination. At that same workshop, we did an exercise called shoaling, where a group of 2 or more people observe one another's movements very closely, gradually mimicking and enlarging and developing those movements until the group begin to move together as one. The day before, the exercise had worked well, but on this occasion, there were some new members in the workshop, and the group was having difficulty moving together. After the exercise, a participant observed, "We weren't taking time just to be together. We workers need to be together if we're going to make our voices heard." In another exercise we play called Yes and, two people accept and build on each other's suggestions, much like the Shoaling exercise. For example, I begin by saying, we'll go to the beach, and you might say, yes, and we'll go swimming. And I might say, yes, and we'll swim out as far as we can, and you might say, yes, and we'll swim until we reach an island, and so on. Well, we tried this exercise at a workshop last week in a community centre serving workers at the surrounding factories. Participants got into pairs and were left to play with the one simple rule that you must accept and build on your partner's suggestions. And a security guard from a local shoe factory and somebody who worked inside came up with this. Yes, and we'll go fishing. Yes, and we'll catch a fish as big as the river. Yes, and we'll invite the whole village to come and eat it. Yes, and once we've all eaten some, you and I will notice treasure inside the fish. Yes, and we'll become rich. Yes, and we'll go to Hong Kong. Yes, and we'll text our friends from the back of a limousine. Yes. There's something almost allegorical about that one. I don't know why. We face challenges in doing this work, and I make mistakes all the time in workshops. Sometimes moving as a group is actually stifling to self-expression because the same people always speak up and maybe quieter characters get crushed in the process. Also, I don't know if you've noticed, but I'm not Chinese, and nor am I a worker. I'm in fact a tall, slightly awkward, shivering Englishman with a big nose. And this isn't without its problems. Working in these contexts, after all, you can never be free of associations, and England does have a pretty awful, long colonial past. But for all the trouble it causes me, I still haven't come up with a particularly good answer for why I'm involved in this project and what right I have to be involved in it. But I am involved in it, so there. With my company, New Common Theatre, I've done performances in canteens like this one, which was at a smartphone and tablet factory. There were about 3,000 people trying to have their lunch. This is on the factory floor in Foshan of a factory actually making workers' overalls. This is a plaza also in Foshan. And we've done performances basically anywhere where workers congregate. And we're working towards doing a big show next year in collaboration with labour organisations in Guangdong, Beijing and Tianjin. The show's being developed by the cast, some of them professional actors, some of them factory workers, and we're bringing in an orchestra and projection mapping to deal with the scale of some of these venues and the scale of some of the audiences. And to give you an idea, this is a 3.3 million square metre shipyard. It's the biggest in China. It's the second biggest in the world. We're performing in this space for an audience of 5,500 people. This is another factory producing smartphones and tablets. We're doing a performance here for 32,000 people. And this is a plaza in Shanxi, Taiyuan, where we're performing for 11,000. So these are places of a scale that I'm not used to working in, but I'm very excited by, particularly with the use of projection mapping and other technologies. Well, performances are important, but I'm beginning to see the process that leads to performance as at least equally important. As a performer, I've received training on how to tell stories, although today perhaps we'll go against that. In the factories and community centres where I've been working, there are people who want to share their stories, but perhaps don't have the tools or just the opportunity to tell them. So we have plenty to learn from one another, and so far it's working out all right. Thank you.